It was named for the city in which it stands, a house built to greet the masses with open arms. It has welcomed the great and the powerful and courted the brilliant and the bold. It has brought us the champions of sport and the leaders of the world. Spanning the years, it has become home to us all, and inside its walls, we've seen history unfold. And so we remember the passion, we remember the joy, and when the crowds go silent, we will remember the roar. Chicago Stadium, built in a time and place reflective of its character, rough and rugged, grand and glamorous. It has stood proudly in Chicago's West Side for nearly 65 years, serving the city as a mecca for sports and entertainment.
The noise factor, everything about that makes Chicago Stadium the greatest building only in not North America, but in the world to watch an event out of. It is the best, and it's the #1 gross in the National Hockey League today. So that's quite a tribute to those people who had the idea of building a building back in 1929 that can compete with the best of them today.
Chicago of the 1920s was a city renowned for its competitive politics and organized crime. Gangster Al Capone ruled Chicago's underworld, cornering the market on every vice imaginable.
So crime was very, very prominent, very, very powerful. Capone and his cahoots had major influence in the Republican Party, which was very viable in Chicago in those days. Chicago was a two-party city.
The Jazz Age was in full swing in America. It was amid this social and political climate where Chicago Stadium found its origins.
Other cities at this time had prominent indoor arenas for sports. The 1920s was the golden age of sports. We had the amphitheater, we had the Chicago Coliseum, which was small and dated and not very popular with the public.
A Chicagoan by the name of Patty Harmon, who made his money in dance halls and amusement parks, set out to construct a sports arena big enough and grand enough to rival the sports temples being built in other U.S. cities.
It was in 1929 when Patty opened the Chicago Stadium, and it's interesting that in his prospectus to the investors that he said the six-day bike race would be one of the biggest generators of money for the Chicago Stadium.
Construction began in 1926, with promises for completion within 9 months. 3 years later, America's largest indoor arena was unveiled to the city. Its first event was a boxing match pairing Tommy Loughran and Mickey Walker. An opening night crowd of 18,000 witnessed Loughran defend his light heavyweight title in a 15-round decision.
Unfortunately for Harmon, his plans for the stadium did not work as well as anticipated.
After disappointing gate receipts in the advent of the Great Depression, Harmon was forced out of control by other investors within a year.
But within 6 months, Harmon's tenure with the building he had built was gone. He was essentially kicked out of the business he had started. Not long thereafter, in 1931, he died in a car crash. And according to the Tribune of the day, he said all he had left was the $2.50 in his pocket.
As the stadium was being built in the late 1920s, so too was a newly founded hockey team, which played its game at the Chicago Coliseum. The city of Chicago received an NHL franchise in 1926, when Major Frederick McLaughlin paid $12,000 for the team he would name the Blackhawks. In 1934, just 8 years after their inception, the Blackhawks won their first Stanley Cup. In the deciding game, right-winger Mush March broke a scoreless deadlock with a goal 60 minutes into overtime against the Detroit Red Wings. The Stanley Cup champion Hawks had arrived.
When I was a kid, I was in here with the 1934 Stanley Cup Series, which was total excitement. And I just can't help but look back now and think of some of the people that played in that series. People like Mush Marsh. The crowd was fantastic.
It didn't take the Blackhawks long to make a return visit to Stanley Cup glory. Just 4 years later, in 1938, the Hawks defeated the Toronto Maple Leafs 3-1 to win their second cup in the team's young history.
And there's been so many exciting events. And the history of the Chicago Stadium is second to none.
The Blackhawks were but one of the draws in the stadium's early years.
People remember the six-day bike race. People used to come around and sit all night while these six-day bike races went around and around and around in teams of 2.
Six-day bicycle racing was a cornerstone event and proved to be a major attraction throughout the 1930s.
It was a very exciting time because the races ran for 6 continuous days, morning and night, and the infield was all filled with people all the time, and there were singers and people that were promoting their newest songs, and there were acts, small acts and so forth to entertain the people.
Chicago's Carl Stockholm, a World War I veteran, led a distinguished field of cyclists from around the globe.
It was a man stripped down to racing equipment, understand? A sort of atmosphere of danger that kept people on edge. It packed them in.
The six-day bike races inspired the installation of the stadium's prized possession, the Barton pipe organ. The organ was built to provide music accompaniment to events such as the bike races.
At that time, the organist, Mr. L. Melgard, who was the first organist here for 40 years until he died, accompanied every function that went on in this building.
Its 4,000 pipes are actually fixtures within the stadium structure and equal the decibel level of 25 brass bands.
Pipe organs literally move air in the building. And because some of the bass pipes are so big and so heavy and the vibrations are so deep, it definitely could shatter many things.
The stadium was the gracious host to myriad sporting events throughout the 1930s. Football, however, was not in the grand scheme. But when a blizzard struck Chicago in 1932, the NFL championship game between the Bears and Portsmouth took refuge in the shelter of the stadium.
And they put dirt on the floor to play. Now, the indoor area wasn't big enough for a 100-yard stadium, so they played with 80 yards, which had to suffice.
The Bears won 9-0 on a touchdown pass from Bronco Nagurski to Red Grange. The task of keeping dates filled brought with it make-or-break challenges.
It's the biggest building in town. You know, if you're coming to town and you want to draw a crowd, where would you go? The Chicago Stadium.
Events ranging from dog shows and horse shows to botanical conventions and cooking schools were booked in an attempt to fill the building's calendar.
It was a tremendous asset to the west side of Chicago and gave it a big boost. So these are great things for the city, for the area, and for the entire country to have such spectacular stadiums available for sports events and entertainment.
Wrestling was a popular ticket as fans witnessed a battle of the sexes and victory for the women's movement in an unusual main event. Other grappling favorites to do battle included Mountain Man Dean and Gorgeous George. But the management team that followed Patty Harmon experienced a short tenure as well, running into eventual financial disaster. Enter Arthur Wirtz and James Norris, who in 1934 bought the stadium and saved it from financial ruin.
Mr. Wirtz was a master showman. He visualized immediately that a star like Sonja Henie coming out of the Olympics could be the focus for a very glamorous skating show.
In 1934, Arthur Wirtz, embarking on one of his most successful ventures, signed Henie to a contract and created the Hollywood Ice Review.
Her show usually had about 60 professional skaters, great choreography, costumes, the works. Very, very elaborate show.
The enormous sums brought in by the Ice Review secured the stadium's financial future.
And there was a certain mystique about watching her on the ice. And she was something else, a big moneymaker for the Chicago Stadium.
Henie would go on to become a star on the Hollywood screen, paving the way for future performers like Barbara Ann Scott and Peggy Fleming, both of whom entertained stadium audiences. Arthur Wirtz created events to fill the stadium.
Oh, he's a fantastic, a great businessman, but also impresario. I mean, that take arenas that were built as convention centers and to make them entertainment centers.
The rodeo was just one of the attractions he produced. It featured such personalities as Roy Rogers, who, according to legend, proposed to Dale Evans backstage at a stadium roundup. The stadium was home to the Cole Brothers Circus, which entertained generations of Chicagoans, and was made possible by the vision of Arthur Wirtz.
You took students to come and visit before the show the elephants and the tigers and the lions, and to see the expressions on their face was something I've never forgotten.
Creating a circus atmosphere of their own, the world-renowned Harlem Globetrotters were one of the first basketball teams to play at the stadium.
And they played out of Chicago. And one of the major venues, of course, was the stadium. They were the great basketball draws throughout the 1950s. They were more popular than any NBA team was.
College basketball made its way into the stadium in the 1940s with weekend doubleheaders. The games were a tremendous draw among college fans. Popularity grew to a point where in 1967, even the storm of the century could not keep spectators away from seeing college basketball's greatest player.
And it was the craziest thing. You look down the street and here comes the people. It just looked like a horde, an army marching down Warren Avenue and Madison Street, because this was Lou Alcindor, the greatest basketball player that anybody'd ever heard of, and everybody wanted to see him.
But when it came to basketball, or any other event for that matter, nothing brought more magic to the stadium than the genius of Michael Jordan.
There has never been an attraction like Michael, but then there's never been a performer like Michael. And he was without a doubt the most important sports figure of our time, and maybe the most important figure without the word sports attached to it.
Let's do it for Chicago. Let's do it for Mayor Kelly, for George Brown, everybody. Let's get together. Put this thing over, please.
The stadium has been Chicago's gateway to the entertainment world throughout the years. A major vehicle delivering the finest in entertainment to the stadium was Irv Kupcinet's Harvest Moon Festival, an annual evening of song and dance, where a young Frank Sinatra made his stadium debut.
We would line up the kids who do all the latest dance steps. Their competition was remarkable because they were wild dancers. And to embellish that, we brought in a whole flock of stars from Hollywood, and Frank Sinatra was one of the biggest, Milton Berle, Jack Benny.
The renowned Gate 3.5 at the west end of the stadium welcomed the incomparable Bob Hope to Chicago, as well as the old crooner Bing Crosby. The unforgettable Jimmy Durante was yet another favorite who brought Hollywood to West Madison Street.
And then one year we had Sinatra, Como, and Colombo, the three greatest singers of the year, all on the same stage at the same time. That was the apex of the thing.
In later years, performers such as Red Buttons, Danny Thomas, and Paul Anka would grace the stadium stage.
And that Harvest Moon Festival, the money of which went to charity, will fill the stadium for about 25 years and 25,000 people every year.
Jazz sensation Ella Fitzgerald rivaled the Barton pipe organ on the decibel scale. And speaking of noise, only a Saturday night Blackhawks crowd could match the screams heard at a command performance by Elvis Presley. From the kings of comedy to the king himself, for over 60 years, the stadium has been Chicago's venue to the stars.
And I hope that everyone will try to be there on December the 20th at the Chicago Stadium.
Contrary to popular belief, Chicago earned its reputation as the Windy City not from its blustery climate, but by the renowned banter of its politicians. And at no time has the focus on Chicago been greater than during the national conventions of the 30s and 40s.
It was a perfect place for that. They built the stands so that everyone could be, they'd sit low and they could look up and watch them, and it was a very ideal setting.
The platform of the 1932 Democratic and Republican conventions held at the stadium centered on two key issues, the Depression and more important to some, prohibition.
As soon as we can get enough of the platform committee sober enough to turn in a platform, we'll be through.
Amid beer raids by the Chicago police on nearby Halsted Street, the Democrats, it appeared, were ready for an end to the dry spell.
Recommend the passage by Congress of a resolution repealing the 18th Amendment to the Constitution.
While Republicans maintained a more Puritan posture.
The Republican Party has always stood and stands today for obedience to and enforcement of the law as the very foundation of orderly government and civilization.
In the case of the Democratic Party, the party owed a lot to Chicago because beginning with Roosevelt's victory in '32, Illinois, and especially the Chicago Democratic Party, was a major ingredient in his success.
The Republicans' passion for anti-repeal was exceeded only by their enthusiasm for their incumbent candidate, Herbert Hoover.
As the next President of the United States, I nominate him, and I give him to you as your candidate, our great, glorious Californian, Herbert Hoover.
It was in the 1932 gathering that Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the New Deal. Following his victory, the country's new president shared his vision in a speech at the stadium.
As your commander-in-chief and as your comrade, you I have called to the colors again.
Franklin Roosevelt and Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak maintained a close relationship. The two were together in Florida when an assassin's bullet intended for the president struck and killed Cermak.
And he made that memorable comment, "I'm glad it was me instead of you," which was probably put into his mouth by some newspaper man. But it's part of the legend of his assassination.
Chicago honored their fallen leader in a wake held at the stadium.
One of the great events of the Chicago Stadium, not a happy event, of course, but one of the great events of the stadium.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
By the end of the decade, the nation's focus turned to the war in Europe, as the stadium would host yet another Democratic National Convention in 1940. Despite immense popularity, President Franklin Roosevelt faced opposition from high ranks within the party. But a mysterious voice from the bowels of the stadium would leave no doubt about the nomination.
And throughout the balloting for FDR, the voice came that nobody knew where it came from. We want FDR, America wants FDR, Chicago wants FDR. And this voice from the sewer kept boomeranging throughout the whole, during the entire vote. Of course, FDR won easily, but this is a part of the showmanship and part of the Chicago politics that the people don't often know about.
As World War II drew to a close, the stadium opened its doors once again to both Republicans and Democrats. On the agenda this election year was the role of women in industrial America.
We have conserved hope and ambition in the hearts of our people.
Thomas Dewey was the frontrunner for the Republicans, as FDR sought an unprecedented fourth term.
Will it be Dewey or Roosevelt?
Harry Truman was named FDR's running mate, after a young page named William Wirtz delivered Truman's 11th hour telegram of acceptance to the podium.
I picked it off the floor and it was torn. They still have it. It's a pretty good piece of historic moment. If that telegram had not gotten through, I'll also have been president rather than Truman.
As Chicago Stadium became a national landmark for the nation's politics throughout the 1940s, it became a local landmark for the struggling Blackhawks.
For a number of years, for most of the 50s and the late 40s, had been in the doldrums, and the attendance at the stadium probably was down to 4,000 or 5,000, just a mere fraction of what you see now, or what you had seen before sometime in the 30s.
The Hawks endured lean and meager seasons from their Stanley Cup triumph in 1938 until 1952, when Arthur Wirtz and James Norris bought controlling interest in the team.
I think between 1940 and 1960, they had a winning record only 1 year. When the Blackhawks did not do well on the ice, they often did not draw well. Wirtz comes in and takes over the team. And Wirtz does a very good job in the late 50s in revitalizing the team.
With the future of the Hawks in dire straits, the new ownership sought the services of Tommy Ivan, who was coming off 6 league championships and 3 Stanley Cups as coach of the Detroit Red Wings.
It was a 6-team league, and it finished 6 for 6 consecutive years. So that's what I have to say. My wife had all the courage, you know, to leave. We were leaving the first place club to come over to a last place club, but it worked out fine.
Serving as the team's general manager, Ivan's gift for finding talent would save the Hawks and open the door to an entirely new era in Blackhawks hockey. The 1940s and 50s provided the world with the golden age of pro boxing. During this era, 2 arenas shared time as the country's boxing capitals, Madison Square Garden and Chicago Stadium.
At one time, the Chicago Stadium, with all the tradition it has, was the place for the big fights, and everybody wanted to come in here and fight.
It was big, it was glamorous, but you had some big names, you know, like Joe Louis. I mean, there still isn't anybody like Joe Louis.
Joe Louis took on Lee Ramage at the stadium in the early years of his career. In the twilight of his reign, he faced Pat Valentino in a 1949 exhibition.
When he fought in Chicago and he fought Lee Ramage, he was on his way up, 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 up. He was a sensational man to watch because he had one of the greatest left hooks you've ever seen for a heavyweight. Had a beautiful jab.
Serving as the headquarters of the International Boxing Club, a governing organization headed by Wirtz and Norris, the stadium was the site of the best in championship boxing.
Between 49 and 53, about 80% of all world championship fights that were held in the United States were held by the IBC. So they completely controlled the boxing business.
Following the retirement of Joe Louis, the commission was organized to determine a champion. That champ was found at the stadium when Ezzard Charles won by decision over Jersey Joe Walcott. Sugar Ray Robinson awed the stadium crowd on numerous occasions, including a showdown with the Raging Bull, Jake LaMotta.
And the famous words of Jake LaMotta after that fight right in the ring, that one I announced. He said to Ray Robinson, "But you couldn't knock me down."
Sugar Ray's showdown with Rocky Graziano was brief but fierce, with both fighters hitting the canvas.
"Don't make a big deal out of this," he says. "Graziano's scared of me. I notice it in his eyes. He's scared." And 2 rounds later, he went out there and knocked him out.
Sugar Ray became the first fighter in history to win the 160-pound title 3 times, knocking out Bobo Olson at the stadium in 1955. He would go on to win the title 5 times.
One of the greats that I have ever seen, a great fighter. He was like an architect in the ring.
For many fans of the sport, no battle rivaled Rocky Graziano and Tony Zale's legendary middleweight title fight.
I asked him, I said, "How do you know you're going to win the fight?" He said, "Because they'll carry me out dead. That's how much this fight means to me." You know? And I'm quite sure Zale had the same attitude. But when I saw him knocked out, and to recover and get up and then knock out Zale, of course Graziano won it, I just never thought I'd see anything like it.
Although Chuck Davey got the worst of his fight with Kid Gavilan, his post-fight recovery changed his life.
He got all cut up in that fight. His face had, big gashes and stuff. They took him over to the hospital. He ended up marrying the nurse. And they had, I think, 9 kids.
Heavyweight champion Rocky Marciano's stadium appearance brought him face-to-face in a duel with Jersey Joe Walcott. The Rock dropped by only long enough for a cup of tea, flooring Walcott in the opening round.
The fight begins, and he throws a punch and knocks Mr. Walcott down and out 1 minute, 10 seconds of the first round.
It was youth over experience in 1956, when 21-year-old Floyd Patterson KO'd Archie Moore, nearly twice his age, to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. And of all the great champions to appear in Chicago, there were perhaps none greater than a brash young fighter named Cassius Clay, who in 1960 won the Golden Gloves light heavyweight title at the stadium, before climbing to loftier heights as Muhammad Ali.
Here's a guy that's going to be champion of the world one day. He was that beautiful to watch even as an amateur.
The reign of the IBC witnessed boxing's most glorious era. Unfortunately, its fate was doomed in U.S. courts when it was ruled a monopoly and dissolved in 1957. The 1960s marked the dawn of a new age in America and the world. The heated presidential election between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy would set the course of policy for a new decade. In the closing days of the campaign, the two candidates were dead even in the polls, prompting the young senator from Massachusetts to turn to the city of big shoulders for help.
Mary Daly called him and said, "You're not going to carry Illinois, you must come in here." So he came in, and Mary Daly organized a torchlight parade, which is the traditional democratic format where they meet at City Hall and march right down Madison Street, to Chicago Stadium.
Televised live, JFK's rally at the stadium was considered a crucial appearance in his presidential victory and a memorable moment in the city's political history.
It was a huge success. He was electrifying. He had that huge crowd, and it had to be one of his finest days ever.
If the stadium is remembered for anything during the 1960s, it will be remembered as the time the Chicago Blackhawks came of age.
Oh, it was huge. I mean, people wait till the schedule came out, and they made their social schedule after they got the Blackhawks schedule.
The acquisitions of young talent orchestrated by Tommy Ivan brought new life to the team in the late 50s.
Oh, they were a well-balanced team. We had good clubs then. We've had a pretty good hockey club every year, a good competitive club. But naturally, when you win the Stanley Cup, why, it means more.
Two arrivals in particular would change the course of Blackhawk history. One was known simply as the Golden Jet.
There's a new hero on the international sports scene, Bobby Hull. The hockey ace of the Chicago Blackhawks suddenly finds himself besieged by autograph seekers after putting a new scoring mark on ice.
Hull, who was at that time quite a sensation because he was an 18-year-old kid who had the look of a movie star, if you want to look at it that way. He was a dramatic player.
I've always said if somebody offered me a franchise in the National Hockey League and gave me a choice of any player I'd ever been associated with or played against or anything, I would take Bobby.
Bobby Hull was the definition of speed, power, and greatness. His charisma in Chicago captivated the city.
And he would barrel down the ice at very high speed and shoot his slap shot at about almost from the blue line, sometimes right across at about 120 miles an hour. And if it was on target, it either would go in or make an awful thump.
If Hull personified natural ability, then Stan Mikita personified endless determination.
He relied more on guile and on being a pest. He was known as a pesky player.
Possessing a unique intelligence of the game, Mikita was the best center of his time.
Stan Mikita was a tremendous hockey player. He, for 2 years, I think he led the league and he had the best defensive record for a centerman, so that speaks for itself.
Hall of Fame goalie Glenn Hall ruled the nets with such skill, he was known simply as Mr. Goalie.
Good goalkeepers, Glenn Hall. You got to have goalkeeper. If you haven't got goalkeeper, you're dead.
Add players like Pierre Palat, Ken Warham, Murray Balfour, and Eric Nestorenko, among others, and you have the makings for a Stanley Cup run in 1961.
Well, it wasn't what you'd call a Cinderella team. I mean, we built it gradually. It didn't happen overnight.
Facing Detroit in the '61 finals, the Hawks relied on goals by Reg Fleming, Ab McDonald, and Eric Nestorenko in the sixth and deciding game, as well as the flawless goaltending by Glenn Hall to beat the Red Wings. The Hawks hadn't won a final in 23 years, but under head coach Rudy Pillis, the Stanley Cup would return to Chicago.
We had players at that time I thought worked pretty hard. I don't say harder than the players are working now. I don't mean it that way, but they seem to really put everything they had into it. Maybe a little extra, too.
Some Hawks fans missed the cup more than others, as Andy Frayne usher Les Modesti discovered when he apprehended a man making his way out of the stadium with the prize trophy.
But he didn't get away with it. He got up to the door, and I put my arms on him, took him back in with the cup. And I said, Mr. Woods, give me a check for $100 or something like that. He said, reward, that's your reward.
Broadcaster Lloyd Pettit enjoyed an unforgettable first year as the voice of the Blackhawks.
And in the press box, there was a concrete ceiling about 2 feet over my head. And I get excited at games. And when the Blackhawks would score, with my microphone, I'd jump up and yell a shot and a goal and crack my head on the cement ceiling.
The Blackhawks would enjoy continued success throughout the 1960s. A return engagement to the Stanley Cup Finals in '62 matched the Hawks with Toronto. Highlighted by the inspired play of Stan Mikita, who scored 2 goals in Game 2, the series would not be decided until Game 6 at the stadium. Bobby Hull's lone goal in Game 6 would not be enough, as the Leafs would triumph in the end with a 2-1 victory.
I think the most exciting thing about Chicago Stadium was the audience, because they were always jam-packed. They had standing room only 8-10 deep up on top.
Under the guidance of head coach Billy Ray, who would become the winningest coach in team history, the Hawks returned to the Stanley Cup Finals against Montreal in 1965.
The fans were so great, you know, and the fans had their own favorites. You know, it wasn't always Bobby, it wasn't always Stan. Some fans loved Nestorenko, some fans loved Reggie Fleming, some fans loved Glenn Hall, you know. It was just a great feeling. It was like a family atmosphere around here.
Bobby Hull gave the stadium much reason to roar. Some memorable noise came on a late winter evening in 1966.
The wildest night was when Bobby Hull scored his 51st goal. He became the first player to score more than 50 goals.
The celebration went on for about 10 minutes. There was absolute pandemonium in Chicago Stadium.
Golden Jet driving at center, in on the Ranger defense. Getting set, he may pass or shoot, he drives one,
Hull at that time was as big in hockey, possibly, as Michael Jordan was in basketball till recently. Hull was probably many ways the most recognizable athlete in Chicago.
Despite 3 Stanley Cups in the team's history, the Hawks had yet to win the Prince of Wales Trophy. That long spell was broken on stadium ice in 1967 when the Hawks beat Toronto to clinch first place in the NHL.
In '66-67, we broke that hex and finished in first place in the 6-team league, you know, and that was really a great, great season.
And who could forget the accomplishments of the 1970 season, when the Blackhawks went from last place a year before to their 2nd Prince of Wales Trophy.
I think the first time you come in as a rookie is very special to you. You look around and you have never been in a building this big. Plus 1969, when we went from last place to first place and we beat Montreal 10-2, was very special to all of us as rookies and even as veterans.
The arrival of new talent brought the Blackhawks continued success.
Tommy Ivan could have said, well, I want that guy or I want that guy. He said Esposito, and his first year with the Hawks, he had 15 shutouts.
Tony Esposito's command of the Nets made him one of the game's greatest goaltenders. His 15 shutouts in the 1970 season stand as an NHL record and inspired his nickname, Tony Zero. The 1970 season would also see Bobby Hull score his 500th career goal. Fellow legend Stan Mikita would pass the same milestone a few years later.
In the 60s, the Hawks were an internationally known team because they had these 2 superstars. But at the time, Hull and Mikita were on a par, let's say, with Rocket Richard and Jean Beliveau, and Gordie Howe, of course.
In 1971, Hull scored goal number 545, surpassing Maurice Richard and placing the Golden Jet second on the all-time list. 1971 would bring the Blackhawks to yet another Stanley Cup Finals. In a classic showdown with Montreal, the Blackhawks dueled the Canadiens to a final 7th game.
20,000 fans jammed Chicago Stadium to see this final game of perhaps the most exciting and dramatic Stanley Cup playoffs in NHL history. Because of the excitement, the CBS television network preempted its prime time regular programming to carry this game.
The Hawks took command with a 2-0 lead behind goals by Dennis Hull and Dan O'Shea, much to the delight of the stadium crowd. But in a dramatic finish, the Canadiens dashed the Blackhawks' hope for victory, coming from behind to win 3-2.
That was heartbreaking, really, because we were ahead in the final game. You know, if the players play well, the team plays well, you can't do any better than that.
A rematch with the Canadiens in 1973 brought more drama and excitement to Chicago. Pitt Martin's hat trick in Game 6 at the stadium enchanted Hawks fans, despite a Montreal victory to take the series.
You know, we had such great years, and it was so much fun. You really have nothing to regret. You know, sure, you would like to have won the Stanley Cup, but we didn't do it, so we accept that. But we had great, great years.
The '73 season marked the end of an era for the Hawks, who would not return to the finals for 19 years. Today, the stadium salutes its past heroes high above the ice surface. The numbers of Hull, Mikita, Hall, and Esposito remind Hawks fans of the greatness they brought to the game.
By Joe Murphy, back over the Penguin line, dropped it back, here's Roenick to the far dot, cutting in to the back end, shoots, he scores! Jeremy Roenick!
All our people, I mean, God bless them to a man. I mean, there's no gold brick. I mean, they give you honest hockey, and I don't know if we're going to win or lose, but I'll tell you one thing, I mean, we play to win and try our hardest, and I think that's what the fans are interested in.
In a new generation of the National Hockey League, Blackhawk fans hold a passion for the game unequaled anywhere. And it is in Chicago Stadium where that spirit still shines.
I mean, there's no place in the world like Chicago Stadium. He's been around the world and played in all sorts of places. And all I know is Wayne Gretzky last summer, who's been everywhere, said there is no place like Chicago Stadium, so that pretty well says it all.
It was in the stadium where Dennis Savard scored 107 points in 1982, breaking Bobby Hull's record. Where Grant Mulvey scored 5 goals in one game. And Michel Goulet became the third Blackhawk to break the 500 barrier.
Goulet racing, he's got a break! Goulet for number 500! He scores! Goulet! A breakaway from center ice in! Only the 17th player to score 500 goals in his career! Michel Goulet!
The tradition was alive in 1991 when the Hawks finished first in the league, capturing their first President's Trophy. It was also in '91 when the stadium roared as the world watched, and Chicago draped itself in red, white, and blue in support of the American troops in the Gulf War.
As loud as they were and as electrifying as they were, and the chills that they shot through everybody's spine, it was tremendous.
The anthem salute was the Gray Lady's finest hour.
So I met General Schwarzkopf. He said, I've never seen anything like it. He said, I couldn't read the war, and I was in my bunker, and he said, I had it played to all my 541,000 troops. So I thought it was the greatest tribute to American armed services that I've seen.
The stadium sparkled for the NHL's 75th anniversary season as the Hawks honored a proud past. When the Blackhawks won 11 straight games in the 1992 playoffs, the Madhouse on Madison Street welcomed another Stanley Cup Finals as fans witnessed Captain Dirk Graham rise to the challenge.
Now Noonan out of the corner, centering. They score! The hat trick for Graham! Dirk Graham! 3 straight goals for one team, and Dirk Graham has done it. And the hat comes cascading down from the stadium rafters. We're tied at 3.
Throughout the stadium's grandest moments, one element held constant: the enthusiasm of Blackhawks fans.
It's been such a part of our whole family's life, you know, that we spent a lot of time there, have a lot of memories, and it's just like moving out of a home that you lived in for 40 years. It's got to be sad, and it'll be sad that last day when they lower the banners and play the taps. There won't be a dry eye in the place.
And so the tradition beats on, with the names of Balfour, Chelios, and Roenick added to the likes of Esposito, Makita, and Hull. They are all part of a place that has stood as Chicago's world stage for generations, a place that has touched us all with laughter and song, with purpose and passion, a place that was home to heroes and champions and a lifetime of memories. And when her doors close forever, we'll remember the moments of triumph and of joy. We'll remember the thrills we all shared. But in our hearts, above all, we will remember the roar.
Think in terms of bridges burned. Think of seasons that must end. See the rivers rise and fall. They will rise and fall again. Everything must die again, like an ocean to a shore, like a river to a stream, like a river to a stream. It's the famous final scene. How you tried to make it work. Did you really think it could? How you tried to make it last. Did you really think it would? Like a guest who stayed too long. Now it's finally time to leave. Yes, it's finally time to leave. Take it calmly and serene. It's the famous final scene. Now the lines have all been read, and you knew them all by heart. Now you move toward the door. Here it comes, the hardest part. this can never be erased. As the light fades from the screen, from the famous final scene,